Okay, hello. Um, all right, so I'm gonna start by saying a little bit about the midterm assignment. It's not due for a little while, but some people might want to start working on it, I guess. Uh, right, it's due November 4th. It says by 11:55 p.m. I'm not sitting here with a stopwatch waiting to see when the assignments come in, whatever. Uh, um, and it's due on Canvas using the assignments tool. I think that assignment is up, right? Hasn't you, oh, it's not? It is? Okay. It may or may not be up. Wait, let's see. I'll just click on this link and see what's there. Okay. I have to actually create the assignment so you can hand it in. Uh, yeah, there aren't any. I have not created any assignments. All right, I'll do that. There's just going to be one midterm assignment. So whether you do the paper option or the exam option, you'll hand it in at the same place. And hopefully it'll be clear from what you hand in which it is that you did. Otherwise it's a problem. Um, um, right. So the exam version, there's a list of questions and you're supposed to answer two of them for two to three pages each for a total of 4 to 6 pages. Whereas the paper version is also 4 to 6 pages, but it's a one paper. Um, and as I said at the beginning of the course, the idea is that the exam version is easier because I actually ask you the question and you don't have to like justify that this is a good question or anything. You just have to answer it. So the paper version is well, it's harder to do well anyway because although there are these suggested topics, if you look at the suggested topics, you'll see that they're very long and they contain a lot of sub questions, right? The idea not being that you should try to like answer all those sub questions in a list, right? But that those are just like different suggestions for ways to think about this topic. So like you really have to come up with your own way of thinking about the topic and your own thesis and argue for it. Whereas the exam version, like I don't expect to see any like introduction or anything, just like answer the question. Um, right. So it says here in the instructions, your focus should be on answering the questions accurately, not on making an original point or argument. All the questions do require some thought. Uh, and it must be your own work. Uh, I'm not in any way encouraging you to use outside sources to answer the questions or to write the papers either. But obviously, if you do, you have to cite them. Um, and uh, and the questions on the exam version are keyed to the different readings. So there's four for the four lectures on the Aufbau. There's one for the Carnap-Neurath correspondence. There's one for Goodman. And there's one for Quine, which we're reading next week. So you just have to choose two of them and answer them. Um, uh, let's see if there's anything else I want to say about the exam, the paper version. Right. The main focus of the paper should be on the text we've read for this class. You can also use other material if it seems useful or relevant, um, which obviously you have to cite. I don't like care how you cite things, just as long as it's possible for uh, Terry to figure out what you're citing, like to find it. But other than that, I don't care about the format of the citations. So meaning if you're citing the assigned text for the course, then you just basically have to give a page number. But if you're citing something else, you have to give enough information about it that we can find it if we need to. Um, and right, so I recommend writing an interpretive paper, meaning that the focus of the paper is in trying to explain what the authors mean. Um, and um, rather than, for example, to make an argument for or against what they're saying. I think it's easier to do that well. It's in some sense a logical prerequisite to do that. I mean, in real life, it's not exactly a prerequisite, but in some logical sense, you can't argue for or against someone's position until you first understand it, right? So, and these philosophers are not, like most philosophers, are not easy to understand, right? So there's a lot of original arguments to be made about what it is they're saying before you get to original arguments about whether what they're saying is right or not. Um, and it's basically what I do in lecture every every day. um, right? I talk about what I think the authors mean, and it's not obvious. And I'm like, they might mean this, they might mean that. You might think they mean this, but I'm going to claim they don't. Right? So there's a lot to say about that. Um, uh, it's a recommendation. The suggested topics are suggested topics. You can write about something else if you want. Although keep in mind that the focus should be on the texts we read for this course. So, um, and yeah, the AI policy, I think I said at the beginning of the course, I'll just say again, you're free to use the AI assistants. However, you would be allowed to use like human assistants. And you should cite it if it's a case where you would have to cite a human who did the same thing for you. Um, uh, and like I don't have a great way of detecting whether you followed that policy. Like the only thing I'm trying out is having this weird like final exam thing at the end where you have to answer questions about what you're said in the assignment. So, oh, by the way, when you work on this assignment, make sure that you keep in mind, keep notes for yourself, whatever, so that you'll be able to do that at the end of the course. Um, I mean, I'm not I'm not going to try to make it tricky or anything, but you will have to remember what you wrote. Um, okay. Uh, are there questions about any of that? Okay. If there's more questions later, it's not due for a while, so feel free to ask. All right. In that case, I'll get on to talking about Nelson Goodman. Uh, so he was an American philosopher. Dates are 1906, 1998. And so this means he's like about 15 years younger than Carnap and Neurath. Um, and I mean, as you can tell from this book, he's he's not exactly a follower of Carnap. Like he's not a logical positivist, but he's very closely connected with Carnap and the other logical positivists. Um, in fact, he wrote this other book, so it was published. So this book was published in 1956, I think, but it's based on lectures. Uh, so this book, Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, is based on the first chapter, which I didn't assign, is based on a lecture he gave in 1946, I think. And then the other three chapters are based on lectures he gave in 1953. So in between, in 1951, he published this other book called The Structure of Appearance. Um, and the structure of appearance is explicitly an attempt to do better what Carnap does in the earlier parts of the Aufbau. So, right, so that's about as closely connected to Carnap as you could get. Um, um, so I want to emphasize that, why did someone write dog?
One thing that's really good. Well, then is, are we sure it means dog? Yeah, that big composition of one. Yeah.
Uh, that would usually be smaller. Well, anyway, sorry. Um, so I want to emphasize that because it's like this actually, in some ways, this sounds very different from Carnap. And like at first you might not, and also the questions he's talking about sound very different at first. So at first you might not notice how much continuity there is here between Goodman and what we read before. Um, but but first of all, it shouldn't be surprising that there is continuity because like I pointed out, Goodman is like explicitly engaged in actually trying to redo Carnap's project, like right in between when he gave these lectures. Um, um, but um, second of all, the overall project actually is still the same in the sense that we're looking for legitimate concepts. And we're doing that in order to um, somehow explain how modern science works, but with the assumption that modern science is basically contiguous with common sense in everyday life. Um, so, uh, so all of that is just like Carnap, and as I'll argue later, is really different from Popper. Um, so, um, that is the idea is that the main problem we have to solve here is uh, what concepts are legitimate to use and how are you allowed to put them together to get, to get scientifically legitimate claims. I I stopped. I was about to say empirically meaningful. I think that doesn't exactly apply anymore, but it's right. That is, um, he's not so sure that empirical meaningfulness is the right criterion here. In fact, he has this footnote. Um, Footnote 1 on page 31, where he discusses the tragic history of the verification criterion of meaning. Right? Tragic, I think, um, tragic because it was a noble cause. right? Like something that's just a stupid uh, idea that ends in disaster is not a tragedy. Um, a tragedy is that there's a noble cause that goes wrong somehow, so that fails. And I think that's how Goodman thinks about this history of empiricist criteria of meaning. So he's not willing to say that what he's looking for is empirical meaningfulness, but it's some kind of scientific legitimacy. And in particular, it's definitely still going to include the idea that you collect evidence for and against things. Um, and um, in the second part of the reading, so the first part of the reading, that is the reading for today, basically like sets up um, the stage for the big problem that's going to come up in the second part of the reading. Um, the second part of the reading is what Goodman calls the new riddle of induction. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what the new riddle of induction is because that's the next reading, but roughly speaking, um, it's going to have to do um, with a question something like this. So suppose I have a piece of copper, and I find that it conducts electricity. Suppose I have a piece of copper. Actually, I'm going to put both together. So I have a piece of copper on this table. You can't see the table on the YouTube video, but it's there, believe me. So I have a piece of copper on this table, and I find that it conducts electricity. So that, according to the whole idea of induction, which, as we'll see, Popper actually rejects, right? But according to the usual idea of induction, if I find that this piece of copper on the table conducts electricity, that's a small piece of evidence for the thesis that all copper conducts electricity, right? I mean, it doesn't go very far, but it's a beginning. Then I check other copper and I see that it also conducts electricity, and I build up more evidence for the thesis. Um, but it isn't evidence for the thesis that all objects on this table conduct electricity. Now, I mean, you might think it was because, let's say there's only a finite number of objects on the table, right? So now I've found that one of them does. So the probability that they all do has gone up. Um, but you have to understand, like, in what sense Goodman is going to take this thesis that all objects on this table conduct electricity. It's going to mean, like, suppose I have something over here that doesn't conduct electricity, and I bring it and put it on the table. Will it conduct electricity now because it's on the table? Right? And the answer is no, we don't expect that. And the fact that this thing on the table conducts electricity is not a piece of evidence for that, right? It doesn't make that more likely. So there seems to be a difference between kinds of claims that are like suitable for inductive proof and others that are not. And this is going to be a big problem for Carnap or for anyone who has a project like Carnap's, because like all the predicates here are empirically meaningful. It's copper, it's on the table, it conducts electricity. Um, and logically speaking, syntactically speaking, for example, there doesn't seem to be any difference between the two cases, right? In both in both cases, I have a claim like, you know, P of A, and I want to conclude that for all x, P of x, and the only difference is in one case, well, okay, let me I have in both cases, I have that A is both P and Q. And I want to use that as evidence that everything that's P is also Q. Right? So in the first case, P is copper and Q is conducts electricity. And in the second case, P is on this table and Q is conducts electricity. So as you can see, there's like no formal difference between the two cases. There's no syntactic difference. To know that one conclusion is good and the other one isn't, you have to know what P means, first of all, right? You have to know whether P means is copper or is on this table. And then somehow, based on your knowledge of what P means, you have to decide whether you're allowed to do this or not. And of course, when I talk about concluding from this to this, I don't mean that this proves that this is true, but that this gives inductive support to this thesis, right? That it goes some way towards showing that we should believe it. Okay, so the new riddle of induction is going to be about that, but we'll see. Goodman has this very clever example that makes it like, I mean, you might wonder a little bit about things on this table or whatever, but he has an example that makes it really clear that there's a big difference between times when you're allowed to do this and times when you're not, and that it's really hard to explain what the difference is. Okay, so anyway, that's what we're headed for. But that's not directly what he talks about in this reading. So what he's doing in this reading, again, it's a version of what Carnap wants to do. Goodman calls it explanation or explication. Of concepts. And it consists in taking a concept that is, well, so as he says, this is on page 31, what we need to do is, quote, provide an adequate explanation on an acceptable basis. So, right, again, as in Carnap, we have a basis. And Goodman actually talks about different languages or different systems. One is a phenomenalistic system that's basically the same as what Carnap calls a psychologistic basis. Perhaps an autopsychological basis. Actually, it's not entirely clear every time Goodman talks about that here. And he also talks about a physicalistic system or language, right? So it's the same two possibilities that Carnap is mostly thinking about. But the important thing for Carnap is that the basis is empirically meaningful. And Goodman says, well, empirical meaningful, that turned out to be really hard to define, but it has to be acceptable.
Oh, that's clear.
Right. Well, I think it's deliberately unclear. That is, it's supposed to transmit all the actual unclarity of our situation. Right? So,
Someone said that he said the world being unclear is no excuse for philosophy being unclear. I actually think it's pretty sad.
that's true, but on the other hand, like, I mean, at least according to him, that's true. But on the other hand, to the extent that philosophy is not clear, you shouldn't use terminology that makes it sound like it is.
Yeah.
Right. So, right, acceptable is supposed to like um is supposed to encode the it's supposed to like be explicit about what the problem here is. The problem is what will we accept? Or what would we accept? Right? This is an example of what Goodman calls a disposition predicate. Um, and he actually makes that point explicitly in chapter one that I didn't assign, um, but I think it's going to turn out to be actually important that this is also a disposition predicate, just like flexible and the other ones he's going to talk about, inflammable, whatever, right? So, and acceptable means without an adequate explanation. Acceptable without an adequate explanation. So, something we would be willing to accept even if it can't be explained in terms of something else. As opposed to things that are unacceptable. This is usually we would say unacceptable. I'm not sure why Goodman. So you might think it's a British thing, but he's not British. He's American, and anyway, it's not. That's that. um, and I checked 1 year, and I guess unacceptable and unacceptable both occur like since the 17th century or whatever, but unacceptable has always been much more common. um, so like it could be that he's being kind of nerdy about saying that since this is Latin, we should use a Latin prefix here rather than un, which is a Germanic prefix. um, it may be partly that, but I think it's supposed to sound like inflexible, which is his main example, right? Flexible and inflexible. So I think it's supposed to emphasize that we have a pair of dispositional predicates, just like flexible and inflexible. But in any case, leaving that aside for the moment, the idea is that these are things, and we say they're unacceptable. We don't mean we won't accept them under any circumstances. It means they're unacceptable without an adequate explanation. So they're acceptable only if they can be explained in terms of ultimately of other concepts that are acceptable without explanation. So it's just like the reduction procedure that, or the various kinds of reduction procedure that Carnap is interested. Actually, I mean, I shouldn't say that. It's just like Carnap's original reduction procedure. The idea is that we can eliminate these unacceptable concepts by explaining it in terms of the acceptable ones. That's what we're looking to do. And many, if not all, analytic philosophers probably still agree that something like that is what philosophers should be doing, or one of the things philosophers should be doing. Um, um, and this basically is what is this explanation? Like, what counts as an adequate explanation that will allow you to eliminate the unacceptable concepts and replace them with the acceptable ones? Um, well, um, so I think as in Carnap, science and common sense are going to have to be respected in terms of telling us what the extension of the predicates or concepts in question are. I mean, maybe they can be corrected a little bit here and there, but basically, like, for example, if our unacceptable predicate is flexible, we haven't said why, what makes this unacceptable yet. I mean, no, I'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, so if our unacceptable predicate is flexible, so we want to give a definition, a way of picking out the things that are flexible using only acceptable predicates. But we've got to end up calling the same things flexible that we ordinarily call flexible. Right? So in other words, if I give an explanation of flexible in terms of acceptable predicates, and it turns out that when I say that thing with the acceptable predicates, um, this piece of chalk comes out flexible, then that's a failed explanation, right? Because this piece of chalk is not one of the things we ordinarily call flexible. So again, this is just like Carnap in the sense that the test of the system is whether it preserves the logical meaning, or that is the extension of terms. Um, um, Now, Goodman doesn't say anything about the unity of science. He is trying to rule out some kind of metaphysical nonsense or verbiage, right? I mean, there's a continuity. There's the worry about these unacceptable predicates as if that they can't be properly explained, then they may be metaphysical nonsense. Um, but he doesn't say anything about the unity of science, which is so important to Carnap. However, I think that's also important to Goodman. He's just not talking about that here, right? I mean, again, remember the structure of appearance uh, is um, does try to fix the beginning parts of Carnap's system. Um, and here also, although he doesn't do anything to try to develop this, he keeps talking about having a language or system, a phenomenalistic one or a physicalistic one. The idea of a system or language there is presumably that we're going to be able to base everything on acceptable physicalistic predicates or acceptable phenomenalistic predicates. So that will show the unity of science if we can do it. I think it's fair to say that's more important for Carnap than it is for Goodman, though. Okay, so far I've been talking about the continuity. Other questions about that so far? Because now I'm going to start talking about why they're different from each other. Did you notice that when you were reading it, or were you like, what does this have to do with what we were reading before? Okay, I hope it's clearer now that we really are talking about the same subject, even though the way it's phrased is, well, yeah, the terms are different. And I was about to say, like, a lot of the meaning of the project is also different. Um, so, I mean, um, you can see a lot of what's different by looking at the exact case that we're talking about here and the way Carnap approached it versus the way Goodman has approached it. And the thing we're talking about here is disposition terms. Um, so a disposition term is a term like flexible, uh, soluble in water, flammable. Goodman says inflammable, which means the same thing as flammable, but I'm not sure why he did that. Um, so, so the thing about these predicates is, so flexible, for example, Goodman says it means something like bends under suitable pressure, right? The suitable pressure. And so again, there's a deliberate vagueness here. There's a deliberate vagueness because Goodman wants to track exactly the vagueness in the way we use the term flexible. So that vagueness is being tracked by inserting the term suitable. Right? Like what counts as suitable pressure is going to change in different contexts, and that's going to explain why what counts as flexible changes at different contexts. But like roughly speaking, we call a rubber stick flexible because if you do this, it will bend. Whereas we call a steel stick inflexible because if you do that, it won't bend. But of course, if you apply enough pressure to the steel stick, it will also bend. But that's not suitable pressure. That's extraordinary pressure, right? So that's why that word suitable is in there. Um, uh, with too little pressure, I don't see how to get it bad case that way. All right, I'm not really thinking about it right. But anyway, so flexible means bends under suitable pressure. So now suppose you think that um, this term is uh, unacceptable without explanation. And Goodman thinks that all these disposition terms are unacceptable without further explanation. Um, or suppose you just like want to reduce all terms and you want to define it. So you might think you could define it some way like this, like you say that X is flexible if um, X uh, X is under suitable pressure and X bends. I mean, I guess you might first think you could define flexible. You could say X is flexible if it bends, right? But that's no good because all kinds of things that bend under extraordinary pressure are not flexible, and and moreover, flexible things that are not under suitable pressure are not bending. Or anyway, we don't care if they're bending. It's not relevant to whether they're flexible or not, right? So a rubber stick that's not under suitable pressure, whether it's bending or not is irrelevant to whether it's flexible. So you might think you could define it something like this. I guess I should, this is what he wants. You might think you define it something like this. If it's under suitable pressure, then it bends. But the problem with this is, like, suppose you have a rubber stick that's never under suitable pressure, right? So it comes into existence at some time, it's never under suitable pressure, and then it's destroyed. So it was never under suitable pressure. Um, I guess I should have used a steel stick. Suppose you have a steel stick that's created at some time, it's never under suitable pressure, and then it's destroyed. right? So the antecedent here is always false for our steel stick. And therefore, this conditional is always true. That is, whenever it was under suitable pressure, it bent because it was never under suitable pressure. So the steel stick would come out flexible. So we can't use that. Um, so Carnap in a paper called Testability and Meaning, which is from 1936. So, I mean, we didn't read that. It's a slightly later stage than the Unity of Science that we read. In Testability and Meaning, Carnap proposes dealing with this situation by introducing terms by what he calls reduction sentences. And the reduction sentence looks something like this, like right? So this says at any time, if for any x at any time, if x is under suitable pressure at that time, then x is flexible at that time if and only if it bends at that time. Right, so now we've restricted ourselves to talking about things that actually are under suitable pressure. And we say all the things that are under suitable pressure that are bending are flexible and vice versa, right? All and only the things that are bending at the time they're under suitable pressure are flexible. Right, so now like, um, um, well, so on the other hand, if uh, at times when a thing is not under suitable pressure, this doesn't say anything about whether it's flexible or not. Right? Remember, and this is supposed to be the way we introduce the term flexible, right? So the term flexible it wasn't in our language until now. We're introducing it by this definition, but it's not exactly a definition, right? Because it doesn't tell us how to tell under any circumstances whether something is flexible. It only tells us how to tell whether it's flexible if it's under suitable pressure. Is are people clear on what this says and what this does? Okay, so and Carnap says, well, um, as we learn more, we may want to add new conditions like this. That is, we may want to say, oh, by the way, if X is rubber at time t and it's not too cold, whatever, then it's flexible at time t. Um, like what it is we learned there, that's part of the question. But somehow we learned that we want to call all pieces of rubber flexible, even when they're not under suitable pressure and bending. But like leaving aside that possible further development, what we have here is like a partial definition or partial interpretation of what flexible means. It tells us how to tell something is flexible under certain circumstances, but it leaves completely open what is or is not flexible under other circumstances. And this means that it doesn't allow us to eliminate the term flexible. Right? Because the term flexible can occur in all kinds of places where it's not under these circumstances, and this doesn't tell us how to eliminate it. Right? So this in that place in testability and the meaning is the first place that Carnap um, retreats from the idea that reduction is by eliminative definition. It says, well, no, here's this other way of reduction. Introduce a term using these reduction sentences, what he calls them, then yeah, you can't eliminate it, but you've done something to legitimate its use in your language. And in particular, I think from Carnap's point of view, this is okay because it immediately allows us to start gathering evidence as to whether certain things are flexible or not. Right? We go out and we put them under suitable pressure and we see if they bend. And that shows that we're using this term flexible responsibly. That is, we're using it in a way that allows us to argue for or against things being flexible. Of course, there's other things that we don't know how to tell whether they're flexible, so we can't like because we can't put them under suitable pressure. We don't want to or whatever. So in those cases, we won't have any evidence, but it shows that this is a legitimate term and it's okay to have it in our language. And it's okay to leave it there, even though it can't be eliminated. Yeah.
Um, I'm just curious, was Goodman like working on this before or after Wittgenstein had like done his work on philosophical definition?
So, that's a complicated question. When Wittgenstein did his work and when it became, yeah, it was, yeah. Um, I'm not sure when Philosophical Investigations was published. Um, um, I don't think Goodman is thinking about things that later Wittgenstein here, but I could be wrong. Whereas from Goodman's point of view, this is no good because we're still left with this unacceptable term. It's not acceptable to use this term unless you can explain it. And explain it means showing how to get rid of it in terms of acceptable terms. And in explanation of why, Goodman says something that Carnap would definitely not say. This is on page 41. So, I mean, the context here is a little bit complicated, but I'll read what he says. Now, however, we see that to put the problem of dispositions as a problem of explaining occult properties in terms of manifest ones is somewhat misleading, for even the manifest properties we have illustrated are hardly to be countenanced as elements of our universe. So, I mean, what he's saying there is, so manifest is what he introduces as the opposite of a disposition term. The manifest term is a term that's not a disposition term. It's actually the opposite of occult, as Goodman makes clear at certain points, right? That is, disposition terms, the reason they're unacceptable is that they're occult properties. Manifest property, occult means hidden, right? Manifest properties are properties that are not occult. But I mean, other than a clue as to what like medieval precedents Goodman is interested in, that's probably just a distraction to think about that. So just think about manifest as the opposite of disposition, right? So what he's saying in the quote I read is that even if we explain disposition terms in terms of manifest terms, we wouldn't be done because manifest terms also aren't to be countenanced as elements in our universe. right? The implication being that the reason we want to, the reason these are unacceptable, or what it means for them to be unacceptable, is that we can't countenance them as elements in our universe. Right? We don't want to say there are such things as dispositions. And that's why we want to explain them in terms of other things that we want to countenance. So Carnap would not say that, right? That's not part of Carnap's motivation for reducing one set of terms into another. That's metaphysics from Carnap's point of view, right? Like asking, are there really such things? Carnap says that's not a good question. Goodman says that is a good question, and these unacceptable terms are the ones where we don't want to say there are such things. Or we want to explain what it means to claim that there are such things in terms of other things that there really are. um, and that's why, so the difference in motivation that is in Carnap's side, he just wants to make sure we use this term responsibly in a way that allows for arguments about it to be settled. Not all arguments to always be conclusively settled, because he already gave up on that. And even in the Aufbau, that was only in principle, right? That wasn't really practical. So it's not all arguments to always, be settled in a finite time, but it's to allow arguments using this term in general to be responsive to evidence, for and against. That's what he wants. And for those purposes, eliminating it is not necessary, is what he decides at the time of testability and meaning. Whereas Goodman says, and there's a footnote where Goodman directly takes on Carnap's reduction sentences. So this is on page 46, and especially the footnote 11 on page 47. There are just two ways of introducing terms into a system. One, as primitives. Two, by definition. Passages in the Carnap article, and the Carnap article, as you can see from footnote 10, is the one I've just been talking about, testability and meaning. Passages from the Carnap article cited in note 10 have given rise to the impression that there is a new third method of introducing terms by reduction sentences. And Goodman, and the footnote ends, this is rather misleading, for to introduce a term by means of reduction postulates is to introduce it as an ineliminable primitive. So as a kind of logical point of view about the status of a term in the system, I think Goodman is right. That is, a term you use in the system that doesn't have a definition is a primitive. That's the definition of primitive in this situation. But he's missing, perhaps deliberately missing, what it is Carnap thinks this is an example of. What kind of introduction it's an example of. That explicit definition is another example of. Right? And again, the answer is it's introducing a term such that using the old terms, you can collect evidence for and against it. From Goodman's point of view, that's not important. The question is whether your primitives denote things that you think really exist. So if you're allowing this in as a primitive in that logical sense, then metaphysically speaking, you're allowing some entity into your universe. Um, and we'll see the same way of thinking in Quine. Quine and Goodman were pretty close associates. They worked on some things together. Um, so that's a big change from Carnap. Okay. Um, so like so far I'm just setting this up. I'm not talking about what Goodman, how Goodman tries to do this. I mean, so this is going to be no good. This is would be an eliminative definition, but it's wrong. It doesn't give the right extension. It counts certain things as flexible that we wouldn't ordinarily call flexible, like that steel rod that's never been under suitable pressure. Um, so if we can't do this and this won't work, we need a new eliminative definition of flexible. Um, so what the way Goodman tries to do this, and he admits that this leaves various problems unsolved, right? That is, he doesn't claim that he has a complete solution to this. He claims that he has like a new promising way of rephrasing the question so that we can understand better what a solution would look like, roughly speaking. Um, And what he wants to do, in some sense, is relatively simple, but I find that it's very confusing to explain. Um, it's very confusing to explain partly because, so this is the inacceptable term, or these are the inacceptable things. Inflexible, flexible, and inflexible. The acceptable terms that he's going to use. So, I mean, well, suitable pressure and bends are going to be acceptable terms that he's going to use, but he's going to introduce two more acceptable terms that are going to allow the eliminative definition to go through, or that somehow have to be extended to let the eliminative definition go through. That's the way he looks at it. So the new terms are flex and fail to flex, or flexes and fails to flex. So problems start here because there is a verb to flex. Right? I mean, you can't just introduce it, say, I'm going to use flex to mean so and so because there actually is already a verb to flex. Now, uh, the traditional verb to flex. So we're in a worse situation because there's a new sense of to flex, which I'll mention in a second, right? But the traditional verb to flex was a transitive verb. People know what a transitive verb and an intransitive verb is. I don't know if they still like to teach that in school or whatever. No, seriously? Okay. So a transitive verb is a verb that takes a direct object, right? Hit, right? So you hit something is a direct object. Hit this ball. Whereas an intransitive verb is a verb that doesn't take a direct object. Now, this is actually also confusing to explain because most verbs in English, at least most short verbs like hit, are both transitive and intransitive. Hit maybe is an exception, but there's lots of verbs in English like stop. So, right, I can say stop the train. That's a transitive use, but I can also say stop. That's an intransitive use, right? A lot of verbs have that dual nature in English, but yeah, that's the basic. So like, what's an example of a verb that it has no transitive use is like snore, right? Well, I mean, actually, this is also a problem because English verbs are also like this is productive, as linguists would say. Like you can take a verb that up until now had no transitive use and use it transitively, and people will understand what you're doing, right? Um, so I mean, I don't know, you could say like, okay, now snore that song. Right, and you understand what I mean, even though that's not a usual use of, that's not an accepted existing use of it. But all right, never mind that. Forget that. This is not a linguistics class or English grammar class. So normally snore doesn't have an object, right? You snore, you don't snore, but you can't snore something. Right. So the traditional verb to flex was transitive, and usually the direct object had to be a muscle, I think. I don't know if it's ever used with anything else, right? Like flex your bicep or whatever, right? Um, and this is supposed to be intransitive, right? Something flexes like bend. It's supposed to be like bend. Well, of course, bend also has a transitive use, right? Bend is a perfect example. It's just like stop, right? Like I could say, I'm bending, that's intransitive, or I could say, I'm bending the rod, that's all right, never mind. This is supposed to be intransitive, like the intransitive use of bend. Um, so it's different from the traditional use of flex, but that's still confusing. But of course, it's even more confusing because now we have an intransitive use of the verb to flex, which means something like show off, right? Like you're flexing. So that's all very confusing. Um, I can't fix that. Uh, you just Well, I'm going to, first of all, you just have to keep remembering that these are Goodman's own special terminology. Don't associate it with with what flex usually means, right? I think I might also try to do something similar with flammable, and like flams and fails to flam. So here we don't have an existing verb.
That's, that's the argument for why you use inflammable and not flammable, right? Is that it's more coherent because there
inflame.
is a verb to inflame something. Whereas there is a verb to flame, but you don't really use it
There's a verb
transitively
to
like that.
flame, but there's no verb to flam.
Yeah.
So like that's that I'm
There's no
safe.
verb.
Right. Okay. I mean, another problem, I don't know whether to talk about this or not, whether to mention it, it just makes it more confusing. He's using the present, the simple present tense tenselessly. Like he's using flex to mean like it's now flexing, or it will be flexing, or it was flexing. uh, it's not like ordinary English. You just have to try to understand what's happening. Um, I, I don't know whether it's better to mention these things or not mention these things, but I feel like I feel if I do mention them, you can spend all kinds of time worrying about what a transitive verb is and whatever, and it's not really relevant. But on the end, if I don't mention it, you just got all boxed up because the way he's using English is so weird. Okay, but here's how it goes. So, um, so flexes means like equals by definition um, is under suitable pressure and bends. And fails to flex means is under suitable pressure. And doesn't bend. So if we take, here's the universe of all things. Fitting my screen. This is everything, right? Is inside this rectangle. And now we draw a circle. Inside this circle contains all the things that are under suitable pressure. And flexes and fails to flex, divides this circle into two parts. Right? So this is under suitable pressure. And here we have the things that bend and the things that don't bend. Now, I mean, again, I think it would be more idiomatic to say the things that are bending versus the things that are not bending. Right? It's like these are things. Here's another confusing point. Something can be under suitable pressure at one time and not at another time. Something can be bending at one time and not at another time. So really there should be a time argument here, right? Flexes at t, or is flexing at t. Is flexing at t would mean that at that time t, so if I say this rod is flexing at t, I mean that at t, this rod is under suitable pressure, and at t, this rod is bending. Goodman, by a device that seems really natural and obvious to people trained in a certain philosophical way of thinking and seems really unnatural and unobvious to everyone else, says, well, we don't have to worry about that because we'll apply flexes to very short temporal segments of things. Right? The idea being that, like, rather than thinking as we usually do that, like, here's the rod at time 0, and here's the rod at time 1, here's the rod at time 1/2. Is it still on the screen? Yeah, sort of. All right. That this is the same rod. The whole thing is here, and then it's here, and then it's here. We think the rod is like temporally extended, and it has a part here, and another part here, and another part there. Right? So it's the same rod here as it is here in the same sense. This is David Lewis' analogy. In the same sense that if we have a road like from one place to another, it's the same road at both ends. But it doesn't mean the whole road is at one end and at the other end. It means it has a part at one end and has a part at the other end and has other parts in between. So similarly, we think of things having parts at different times. Goodman says, we'll just take short temporal segments of things where there isn't enough time for the pressure to change or for the bending to change. And then we can leave off the time argument. Well, it would be better to leave in the time argument, I think. It would be less confusing, but it would, on the other hand, it'd be really confusing for me to try to put it back in everywhere in Goodman's argument. So you just have to kind of ignore the fact that things that really time should come into this, right? So okay, so forget about this. We have like a timeless universe where everything is either under suitable pressure or it's not, and everything is either bending or it's not. Right, so this line, so I mean, there are things that are bending that are not under suitable pressure. And there are things that are not bending that are not under suitable pressure, right? So there's a way of extending the line between bend and don't bend outside of the circle. But we're not interested in things that bend or don't bend outside this circle, because that's irrelevant to whether they're flexible or not. Right? Like things that are not under suitable pressure but are bending anyway. Who knows why they're bending, but it's not a sign that they're flexible. And on the other hand, right, like it might be because they're under extraordinary pressure. Right? Like some of the things out here are steel rods that are bending. So those are so these are not relevant, and the things that are not bending and are not under suitable pressure, well, I mean, plenty of them are flexible, right? Like rubber rods that aren't under suitable pressure and are not bent. So this is no good. We can, if we want to track the difference between flexible and inflexible, this is as far as we can take it. The things that are bending in this circle are flexible, and the things that are not bending in this circle are not flexible. But again, there's things outside this circle that are flexible or not flexible. Maybe I'm explaining this in a bad order. But, all right, let me just go back to this. So the things that are bending and under suitable pressure are the things that are flexible, right? So this is the realm of things that are flexing or that flex. Right? That was our definition. It's under suitable pressure and it bends. So these are the things that flex. These here are the things that fail to flex. Right? Because that was the definition of fail to flex. It is under suitable pressure and it doesn't bend. And now Goodman says, we can see that the problem of eliminating these dispositional predicates is a problem of, as he puts it, projecting this line outside the circle. Because inside the circle, flex and fails to flex. This is fails to flex. Inside the circle, flex and fails to flex exactly track flexible and inflexible. They have the same extension. This just really reiterating the same thing that we saw in Carnap's reduction sets. Right? If something is under suitable pressure and it bends, that is, if it flexes, then it's flexible. If something is under suitable pressure and it doesn't bend, that is, if it fails to flex, then it's inflexible. Right? So inside this circle, the difference between flex and fails to flex is the same as the difference between flexible and inflexible. Is that clear? Does someone have a question about that? Some people are looking puzzled. So so as with Carnap's reduction sentence, we've so to speak gone part way towards explaining flexible and inflexible using acceptable terms, because flex and fails to flex are acceptable according to Goodman. They're manifest. Well, he says actually manifest versus occult may be a relative matter. He has all kinds of like weird second thoughts about that. But roughly speaking, whether something is bending or not is not a disposition. It's a manifest predicate. Whether something is under suitable pressure or not is not a disposition. It's a manifest predicate. So we've got something that tracks the extension of flexible and inflexible inside the circle. But the question is how to deal with the things that aren't in this circle. And Goodman says that's a question of how to project this line outside the circle. And we know that, like, just going with the difference between bends and don't bends, it's not going to do it. That's what I was just explaining, right? That is, it's not true that all the things outside the circle that bend are flexible and all the things outside the circle that don't bend are not flexible, are inflexible. On the contrary, lots of flexible things outside the circle don't bend because they're not under suitable pressure, so they're not bending. And lots of things outside the circle um, bend but are not flexible, like the steel rod that's under extraordinary pressure. So we need some other way to extend this line outside the circle. And of course, in the end, we want to divide the whole universe into the things that are flexible and the things that are inflexible, I guess. I mean, it's not really clear that, like, you can't be flexible if there's no such thing as bending, right? Like, is the air in this room flexible where you can't bend it? I don't know. But anyway, let's just assume that everything is either flexible or inflexible. So we need some way to divide the whole rectangle, not just what's inside the circle. So the first try would be, and by the way, you should see already that there's some connection here to the problem of induction. I mean, it's not true that all the things outside the circle are things we haven't observed yet, right? This isn't an the difference between the circle and outside the circle is not epistemic. And similarly, it's not true that all the things inside the circle are things we have observed, right? Like a rubber rod that's bending under suitable pressure somewhere like deep inside the earth and no one's ever seen it. I mean, I don't know how we'd get there, but never mind. So like a rubber rod that's bending under suitable pressure and no one's ever seen it and no one ever will, still flexes. But still, this is kind of like the difference because putting things under suitable pressure is how we would observe whether they're flexible or not. At least it's our initial way of observing it until we add other information. Do people understand why I say until we add other information? Because like, if you show me a rubber rod and you show me that it's definitely made out of rubber and the temperature is normal and so forth, then I don't have to apply pressure to it to know it's flexible. I already know that rubber is flexible. But but I know that because because I or other people or somehow put rubber under suitable pressure, and that's right. So like this is kind of like a difference between things that we've examined and things that we haven't yet examined. It's just that I mean, unless the basis is phenomenalistic, this the we that's doing the examining is, so to speak, the world, not us, right? Like the world has examined these things by putting them under suitable pressure, whether we know it or not. Okay, so anyway, that's just as a hint to how this is connected to the problem of induction that's coming up. But okay, so like, how can we do this? And Goodman's first try is to say, well, maybe we should say everything that's of the same kind as something that flexes is flexible. Right? This would be an attempt to generalize what I was just saying about rubber, right? Like we know that all rubber that's under suitable pressure flexes. But we also think that all the rubber that's not under suitable pressure is also flexible. Well, more or less. If it's very cold, it might not be flexible. But uh, we more or less think that all the rubber that's not under suitable pressure is also flexible. And that suggests the way of extending this line is to take all the kinds of things we have on this side and call them flexible, and all the other kinds of things we have on this side and call them inflexible. Right? So the proposal would be that a thing of kind K is flexible. And now this would be a completely eliminative definition. K thing of kind K would be defined as something of kind K flexes. Right? So I take something, I say, what kind of thing is this? Well, it's rubber. So I check, is there anything rubber that flexes? And so I look in here, and yes, sure enough, I find rubber rods under suitable pressure bending. That is flexing, right? Flexing means being under suitable pressure and bending. So I find rubber rods flexing. So I say, yes, something of kind rubber flexes. Therefore, this thing, which is rubber, is flexible. And right, and this allows me to eliminate flexible everywhere now. Right? Because anytime I find anytime someone says, you know, if I say this eraser is flexible, then you just have to ask, okay, what kind of thing is that? That's of kind K. And then you say, okay, does something of kind K flex? And if it does, then what I said is true. And if there is something of kind K that flexes, then what I said is true. And if there isn't, then what I said is false. That would be the definition. Can you see already what kind of problem is going to happen here? What's the problem? Yeah. What are kinds? How many kinds of things are there? Um, like, for example, is thing on this table a kind of thing? Right? If it were, then, you know, if there was one thing on this table that was bending under suitable pressure, that would mean everything on this table is bending under suitable pressure. I mean, so that would mean everything on the table is flexible because this is the same kind as this. But of course, it's worse than that because everything belongs to more than one kind, right? There's too many kinds. Goodman says, you know, at least assuming we can take kind to mean class or set, right? Then any two things are of the same kind because for any two things there's a set that contains both of them. And also any two things are of different kinds because for any two things there's a set that contains one of them and not the other. And for anything, there's a set that contains only that thing and nothing else, namely the set of that one thing, right? So if that's what kind means, then everything is and is not of the same kind as something that flexes. So everything would be both flexible and not flexible, and obviously this is not a good definition. Um, So Goodman says the problem of projection is the problem of finding, so I mean, it is going to be a version of this strategy. We want to find a kind, and now he calls it A. I mean, or he says we want to find a predicate A, but a predicate A has an extension, which is a kind of thing, right? So we want to find a kind of thing that inside the circle, everything of that kind flexes. That we can use that same kind to define flexible outside the circle. But obviously not every kind is usable. So the problem is find one that is usable. That is, we have to find a predicate of the right type that always goes along with flexing inside the circle. So, like, for example, one we think is of the right type is something like is made of rubber, and you probably have to add some other conditions, is at a is at room temperature, is not too thick, right? Because if the rubber is too thick, you can't bend it, etc. Right? So, but there are some predicates that we think are like that. We think they always go together with flex inside the circle, and we think they're the right type to help with projecting outside the circle. That is, that things that have that predicate outside the circle are going to count as flexible. But I mean, but to eliminate flexible, we need to find a predicate that always goes with flex, that that has the same extension as flex inside the circle. And is the right kind. So okay, so we want to be able to do what I just said, but in a way that covers everything inside the circle. I mean, so you can think of this as a big, like, or at least one way of doing it might be to have a big disjunction of like all the different things, like is rubber and at the right temperature, is such and such kind of plastic at the right temperature, is, right? Like a list of all the kinds of things, such that added up together, they yield everything in here. And they're all the right kind to be projected outside the circle. And then we're going to say flexible means that it fits under one of those. Or in other words, it fits under the big predicate that's like, is one, this one, or this one, or that one, or that one, or that one. Or, any other way of finding a predicate like that hits everything in here and is of the right type to be projected outside. Again, we could define flexible eliminatively by saying whatever that predicate applies to is flexible, right? So we call that predicate A. the idea is that inside the circle, um, X is A if and only if X flexes. And A is the right kind of predicate to project outside the circle. So then we're going to be able to define flexible as A. Right? That is, X is flexible will mean A applies to X. It's going to give the right extension inside the circle, right? Because we already said that it's going to have the same extension as flexes. And we know that flexes and flexible match inside the circle. And it's going to have the right extension outside the circle. Why? Because it's going to be the right kind of thing to be projected outside the circle. Of course, this raises the question, what's the right kind? And Goodman says, well, that's difficult. That's a difficult problem. That is to state in general what the right kind is, so that you can give a rule for telling, like if I have some predicate that always goes together with my disposition term under the condition, then I can apply this criterion to see if that predicate is suitable for projecting to cases that aren't under the condition. That Goodman says it might be very hard to find that general rule. But he says maybe in some particular case, we may be able to settle on such a predicate that satisfies us. Like, how do we know that it satisfies us? Well, basically, we would know because the definition of flexible or the definition of exible, right? Whatever our disposition term is, or as Goodman says, QD, right? The dispositional predicate. We're going to define proposal is to define QD of X as meaning AX. Well, we may know that A yields the same extension as our ordinary use of the dispositional predicate. And if we know that, we know this definition is good. Because remember, that's all we're trying to do, match the extension, just as in Carnap, right? Like, we're not trying to claim that this is what we meant all along by the dispositional predicate or something like that. The people who use the dispositional predicate knew that it can be defined as A. Goodman says, no, they don't. People in everyday life and even scientists are able to talk about all kinds of things without telling how they do it. He says it's just like a housewife can drive a car to the supermarket without knowing how it works, right? So the scientist and the everyday person here is compared to the housewife, and the philosopher, well, I guess is a man, right? Is like the I don't know, the mechanic, the engineer, the physicist. Anyway, the philosopher is the one who's supposed to know how the car works. That's the rational reconstruction. The rational reconstruction tells us this is how they're able to do that. Because even though this predicate is no good in itself, it's unacceptable. It's and like if you look through Goodman's list of what's unacceptable, it's kind of things that are spooky. Right? And one of the things on the list is actually angels and devils, which is weird. It doesn't really fit with the other ones. I think it's in there to make the point that he's trying to reject things that are spooky. Right? The dispositional predicates and neutrinos, interestingly, are just as spooky as angels and devils. You shouldn't believe in them. So maybe the housewife thinks that her car works by angels and devils, but the mechanic knows otherwise. And the car works because the dispositional predicate is has the same extension as a manifest predicate that's not spooky. And so this whole discussion ends basically by saying the problem is to figure out how we can get predicates like this that are good. That general problem is hard, but maybe in a specific case, we can recognize that the extension matches, and then we'll know that in that case, the dispositional predicate can be replaced by this manifest predicate. Okay, that's all I have time for. Someone online asked, how are we defining suitable pressure? Yeah, I think when I first introduced suitable pressure, I mentioned that it's deliberately vague because it's going to depend on context what counts as suitable pressure. And similarly, it depends on context what counts as flexible. All right. So with that, I will let you go and I will see you here at the regular time on Tuesday. Thank you.